Hi everyone, I'm Rita Kakati-Shah, your host for The Uma Show. Welcome to your one-stop journey for feeling empowered. We're a platform for change. We build confidence. We are your voice. We want you to be bold, be you, be Uma. Today, we're exploring women's leadership in education, and I'm so excited to be joined by a goddess of go-getting, Baishakhi Tayor, who is the Dean of the College and Vice President for Campus Life at Smith College in Massachusetts. Welcome, Baishakhi.
Thank you so much for having me, Rita. It's such a pleasure and it's wonderful to see you.
Oh, it's wonderful to see you too. So originally, you're a girl from Kolkata that studied comparative literature. Tell us about your upbringing and how you developed an interest for women's studies.
Well, that's like, how much time do you have now? So yeah, as you mentioned, I was born and raised in Kolkata. My parents or my mom is still in the city. Looking back, I had a really privileged, in some way, really privileged upbringing. My parents were able to send me to private English medium schools, and I think that kind of really set some of the course. My dad's family came to India from Bangladesh after the war, while my mom's side of the family were always in what's now India. I know they had a love marriage back in the early 70s, which was a big deal. And I guess there are all these points of sort of moving away from the mainstream. So they had a love marriage. They also had a caste marriage, which was huge. And I have some memories of my grandmother, my dad's mom, treating my mom differently because she was of a lower caste. And all this, I guess, sort of started fostering this desire of looking into gender, understanding gender equality a little bit more at an early age. My dad was heavily involved in the early communist movement in India. So he had a very different approach to understanding equality, understanding equity, understanding fairness, and how that works in labor, relation to labor and division of labor. So and it's also interesting, my grandmother, who on one hand was so conservative that she couldn't get past the caste barriers in the early part of her life, actually always used to call, her nickname for me was Uma, and she would tell me the story of Parvati and all that she did. And so looking back, I think having access to good education, having parents, I am also an only child, which is, at least in my generation, was pretty atypical. So being an only child, but sort of really focusing on the daughter and the daughter's education, I think all that time in Calcutta, and I know sort of my experience with communism in Bengal is very different in terms of like really pushing women's education, women's leadership forward. And the family, and of course I think Yadavpur, when I went there for my comparative literature, had a huge, it's always a journey. It's a little bit hard to say which one, but definitely family and my grandmom. My mom, my nani, is a huge influence. She actually never finished high school. She got married when she was 16. But yeah, I guess I carry the stories of my ancestors in some way, and they have been a tremendous influence. They did not know what women's studies is, but I would say I owe it to them.
I love that. And I think that's really kind of paved the background for you because of the influence you had from your nani and then your own parents as well. It sort of paved the way forward because that eventually took you obviously to the US, where you studied a graduate degree in women's studies. And you also hold a PhD in sociology from the University of Kentucky. Talk to us a bit about your academic choices, really, and how that helped you transition into leadership in academia.
Sure. So, talking about privilege, right? So I really had the privilege of studying what I wanted to study without really even thinking about a career, at the age of 18 in Calcutta. So I loved literature and loved books. So that's what took me to comparative literature. And thanks to amazing faculty, and I really was interested in women's literature, right? Like that was something really new. Now in retrospect, I realized that, Bengal also had a really great tradition of strong women writer, but you didn't hear about them as much in the national level. so I was really interested in women's literature, which sort of, and back in the late 90s, there wasn't any like women's studies program, like a master's in women's studies. And so I was very curious. I also had a lot of Bollywood, and I was like, oh, there is a huge world outside, and I'm getting out, right? Saudi DLJ, and I'm like, okay, I'm getting on the train. No. Anyway, so but women's literature and issues around women, what is it that women's narrative typically are so different? And that's because women's experience in society are different,
Right.
which is what sort of led me to study women's study. And so I had a different kind of journey, right? By PhD you really narrow in. I kind of like went broader, and as I was doing my master's in women's studies, I realized, oh, you can't really look at women in isolation, right? We are all part of this larger fabric in society, and the societal challenges influence everything we do, which kind of moved me into a PhD in sociology with focus on gender and inequality. But again, like I said, I really had the privilege. I was really, and it's such a gift that I had in terms of time where I could study for the love of studying.
Right.
And and then I started doing research, which kind of sort of from research, as I started doing research early on in my career, as I was finishing my PhD, I started realizing that I'm really interested, which is why I did sociology, in the larger systemic, right? I love being in the classroom, but I think my skills and my interest and where I want to focus my time is the larger systemic approach. Right. Which kind of then moved me into thinking about, partly also by luck, I have to and great mentors, who were like, yeah, if this is what you like to do, then you don't need to be just a faculty, you can maybe do both or focus really on administration. And then here I am. In many ways.
I love that. Yeah. So it's almost like
it's a 20-year journey, right? So it's hard again to say it wasn't like I finished PhD and got a leadership position.
Yeah, so I think it's just a lot of your lives and career paths, your interests, mentors along the way that actually helped you lead into that. And I think that's ultimately what led you into even more of the leadership role, because you then served as the Associate Dean of Trinity College of Arts and Sciences at Duke University, and were involved in the Duke Center for South Asian Studies and Program in Education. Tell us a bit about your work at Duke.
Oh, I know this was my first job, so Duke will always be a very special place. And mentors there. I would say my 7th grade teacher and English teacher was probably one of my first mentor, Urmila Auntie, as we used to call her. To mentors at Duke, like Sue Vasilik, who was my first boss, who gave me the job, and I learned a lot from Dean Su in terms of working in higher education, right? Because a PhD doesn't really teach you how to work in an industry, and higher education is still a business at some aspect of it. So from Dean Su to Larry Manetta, and then president of Middlebury College, Laurie Patton, who was the dean of the college at Duke. I would say played a huge role in sort of leveraging. Jan Rigsby, who was the director of the program in education, or department chair of the program in education at Duke, was an incredible friend and mentor who also really helped me see how you can teach in the classroom, and why for higher education, that experience, really understanding students and listening to student voices inside the classroom, and then thinking about ways you can strengthen that voice, you can integrate those voices of the next generation leaders in the work we do, particularly in college or university setting.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, where you actually helps you and listen to the voices of the students, and that actually shapes what you're going to be doing next. I actually love that. Yeah, and you actually then went on from this to serve as the Vice President for Student Affairs and the Dean of Students at Middlebury College in Vermont. So tell us a little bit about that sort of segue into that role.
Yeah, so at Duke, I did a lot of different things. So I didn't have one job, right? So between 2005 and 2015, I don't know, 4 or 5 different jobs at Duke, but I progressively sort of built up on my career. And one of the things that I did at Duke, which is related, I think, to the work I did, or I'm continuing to doing, is I also ran a civic engagement program for 10 summers back in Kolkata. So I would have Duke students come with me to India, work at local nonprofits for 8 weeks. and that sort of really, I would say, kind of like convinced me, not convinced, not the right word, but you know what I mean, like gave me the inspiration that working with students is what I want to do.
Right.
I learned so much from each one of them during those 10 summers. And then President Patton, or the Dean Patton at the time, she became the president at Middlebury College. And this position came open, and I was delighted to get the opportunity to move with her from North Carolina to Vermont, and that was a big shift. Before then, I was always in the global South, or as well as in the U.S. South,
Yeah.
and and you know, it was different. It was learning. It's always been a learning journey, right? But it was very different coming from R1 school at Duke for 10 years to moving to your traditional, amazing, small liberal arts school. But what I'm realizing that the students are very similar, right? And I'm so fortunate I get to work with students who are really just wonderful, smart, brilliant, thoughtful. Uh, you know, you hear a lot about the Gen Zs, but my experience with them are they're incredibly caring and just brilliant. So it was a different kind of learning for me, and again, building relationship with the student, but also learning about life in the New England. It's cold.
I love that. Yeah. And beautiful place to be as well. Absolutely. Yeah. And I love what you just said about how the fact that, you know, you always think that when you are in a leadership position, when you are in a teaching or a faculty role, you are imparting knowledge to your students. But the reverse is also true, that you are learning from the experiences you have. You are learning from the students and their journeys as well. And I think that's really magical in this and how you develop as a leader, I think. So I would say, you know, I guess the next question for you is that how would you say that your background in women's studies has really played a part in your leadership style?
Absolutely. You know, I think the background in women's studies, the background of always thinking about women and trying to put women first. And I'm not saying that the women are the only marginalized group, right? The challenges of people on the margin are great, but I think two things to answer your question precisely. Women's studies has really helped me think about collaborative leadership, right? So there are many different leadership styles, but women's studies have helped me think about that. Women's studies have also really helped me think about, like, because I studied women and how women work, is sort of how do you navigate from the margin to make changes at the center. Right. And then again, that's why I said there are long histories or long traditions of women across the world who have done that silently, who have, you know, changed patriarchal structure within their families one day at a time. So I think that's where studying women and learning about women's history, learning about women's long struggles of resistance against forces of power, and how do you continue to build on changes. How do you, you know, even when you take one step forward and go two steps back, but you stay in the fight, so to speak.
Right.
I would say has strongly influenced. And one of the reasons why at Smith, which is a women's college here in Northampton, I was so excited about this position is that it is a women's college, and there are very few women's colleges. And elite women's colleges. So it was a tremendous opportunity, and kind of like for me felt like, you know, I came here to study women's studies, and now I have the opportunity to work with the next generation of women leader. So for me, it's again that part of my own arc and journey of learning. So yeah, I wouldn't be in this current position at Smith College if it. So I try to remember why I came to the US.
Yeah. No, very well said. And I love the fact that you said that you take a very collaborative approach, because you're right. In order to further women's position in the world, to further gender studies, you have to have a collaborative approach. It's not like a them and us approach, I think. And I love that about what your kind of approach is about this. And you've actually always been an advocate of building a more diverse and inclusive educational environment. So coming back to now to your current role at Smith, and as a member of the President's Cabinet tasked with overseeing a variety of offices that do work collaboratively, how exactly are you planning on achieving this?
Well, I'm only 3 months into my current position here.
That's like the $1 million question. So
yeah. But I'm thinking of a couple different things, and I do want to address that a lot of what I'm thinking now or doing moving forward is influenced by what's happening now in the US, right?
yeah,
Particularly in terms of the racial violence, particularly in terms of recognizing all the oppression that has happened, well, on many different groups, but in this particular moment on the Black lives, and what that community had to endure and fight. So I am really thinking about sort of the issues of inclusion and equity, and how do I partner with our vice president for inclusion and equity, and that office to think about equalizing the education experience at Smith, but also making sure about equalizing all the opportunity that every student's journey is going to be different, right? No matter what, but how every student can make the best of the Smith experience. So they are better set up for success, no matter what that individual decides, she or they decides to do after Smith.
yeah,
So I am really trying to think about how do we, I, in retrospect, as an older person now looking back, how, that arc of, if you can see the arc of continuity, it helps, right? No matter what we do next. So how do we get every student to create their own arc?
yeah,
And make sure each one of them get those skills and knowledge, and that matches what they're interested in learning inside the classroom. Um, and the career preparedness, I do think this post pandemic, it's going to be very different, right? We already know since the 2008 that this generation probably are not going to have careers that are in the same place for 30-40 years. There's going to be movement. The next generation is much more entrepreneurial, and those are all great things, but how do we make sure, and how do we also make sure they can navigate, over 400 years in the US, we are still struggling with racism and how hard it has been. And this is, I'm not just talking about the Black community, like indigenous people in this country, right? Like we have never actually addressed those things. And it's a good thing that this generation is holding us accountable, but how do we, again, listen to their voices and make sure we are meeting their needs? And again, I'm always thinking about, we know it's really important to have good careers, to be able to lead, have skills that doesn't necessarily always just come from the classroom.
no, absolutely, yeah.
And everybody's coming from different backgrounds, so we don't all have the same kind of access. So making sure of those things. So those are some of like very broad things I'm thinking, but I'm really excited of working with my colleagues here at Smith and with the students, so that every Smith student has the same set of opportunities.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think extremely valuable work that you're doing. And I think that's one of the reasons that we bonded in the first place, because, looking at the work that we do at UMA, it's very much similar in the sense that, but we're doing this for the corporate world. We're doing this for companies afterwards. So you've done your education piece, and then what? How do you then equate what you're learning, the bonding, the equality, the diversity, the inclusion to the outside world? So very much from continuing that career transition, that building up that confidence, having your own self-voice and that self-belief, then going forward to the corporate world. So there's a lot of, I think, similarities in that. And I think that's part of the reason I'm very interested actually in the work that you're doing as well. So I absolutely love that and what you're doing. So just all the best, I guess, in this new endeavor that you're doing. And, I know you're going to succeed in that. So.
Oh, thank you. And I know, like I said, I'm looking forward to staying connected on sort of this particular work of how do we create the next generation of women's leaders, or even among us, right? Like I mentioned to you about my friend, like women who now want to find a career path. How do we make sure they have the skills, no matter where they are?
Something that we're always going to be striving for. I love that. Yes, absolutely. I'm now going to pivot a little bit. I want you to tell us a little bit about your family life. If we were to take a weekend, a day in the life of Baishakhi, what would that look like for you?
Like in my dream state or in my everyday life? Well, I'm splitting sort of my time because Smith College is remote this fall. So I'm splitting my time between Vermont and Middlebury and Northampton. And right now in the house, it's just me and my husband, who's also working remotely, and our two dogs, who are rescue dogs from a shelter in North Carolina. And the babies, since our daughter, who's 19, is in college. So the dogs have officially taken on that role. So, I hear it's a very small family. My husband's family, they're all from Kentucky. And Tennessee. My mother-in-law's side family are from Tennessee, and my father-in-law's side are all from Kentucky. So we go there pretty often. So that's why I say I'm always from the global south. And Kevin is working remotely. So it's a very different setup right now. It was, my daughter went to college last year, came back in March, and then just went back. So we are also sort of adjusting to this new normal.
Yeah.
Of suddenly become, it's back to just me and Kevin and no Dia. So my typical day, it's, a weekday is I wake up, I walk the dogs, I work, I try to exercise every day something. And over the weekends, especially now in Vermont, I love paddleboarding. So I try to go out, I go on hikes with friends, and I love food. So I try to eat good food. I do miss my nanny's food a lot, and especially with the Durga Puja season coming up.
Yeah.
So there is so yeah, and I'm reminiscing the days sometimes of not being able to travel. And part of it is, I'm sure you probably experience this in moments too. Our everyday life is pretty busy. You have schools, you have kids, you have dogs to take care of, and laundry and all that. But then there is sometimes, it's this missing home. I watch old Shah Rukh Khan movies, no matter how bad they are, and feel like, yeah, it's like there is this connection. Suddenly, it's a little bit of home. Which I did last night, actually. I watched Yes Boss for about an hour before I was like, okay, this is all I can take tonight. But it was fun.
Yeah.
So it's my typical day. There is, I would say the consistency is the work, making sure eating dinner together and watching something on the screen together. I still like to read, but honestly, I'm not where I would like to be in terms of how much I get to read. But weekends, if I'm on a hike by myself, I would listen to audiobook.
That's nice. You get to spend that time with yourself and sort of catching up with yourself, really, and picking up on things that you kind of wish you would have done had you not had the time. So I think I like that, spending time with outside and doing that.
Oh yes, we're very lucky in New England that we can still go. Well, hopefully for another month or so, maybe another month.
No, I like that. We can't go hiking right here in New York City. So this is something that I'm living through your eyes and ears, so to speak, Baishakhi. So, before we let you go, what advice would you give to our viewers today who are looking to reach a leadership position in academia?
So I guess what I'm going to say is both advice and sort of lessons from my journey. So one thing I would say is raise your hand. Like, if an opportunity even to volunteer comes up, and if it's something that remotely interests you, just raise your hand to do it. Especially if you're early on, or if you were like me, who had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up, and some of it is still true. I don't know what I want to do. Don't be afraid of going on a new adventure. Take the risk. There is always going to be a combination of hard work and luck. I think you need both. And count on your social network for support.
Yeah.
I struggled. I had my daughter while I was still in grad school, and I couldn't have raised her without the support of my friends, who were like, oh, we'll keep her, go to class. Or if you want to do this internship, we'll take care of her. There is, again, this is where the women's collaboration comes in. So I would say, there is no substitute for hard work, and there's no substitute for how luck play out, but definitely build the social network. push yourself to take on some risk.
Yeah.
And especially early on, I can remember which movie I learned this from, but I do believe in it, that when you're young, you can write of everything as an experience. And then I would say that, rely on your mentors. Again, this is part of the social network. But don't, please, make time to volunteer for different things,
Right.
even if it feels like extra work.
Absolutely. I love that advice, especially leaning on your social network and leaning on your tribe. I think that's really something we don't do
I like
enough.
the word tribe, yes, in this case, yes.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Baishakhi, for sharing your wisdom with us today. Amazing. Baishakhi Tayor, Dean of the College and Vice President for Campus Life at Smith College in Massachusetts. And thank you to our viewers for joining us on this empowerment journey. We want you all to embrace that inner goddess of go-getting. We want you to be bold, be you, be Uma.